Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon, and in this video, you are going to learn about the anatomy and function of plant reproductive system, which is a fancy way of saying the flower of the plant. And this is where we get the term deflower, because after the plant is fertilized or the flower is fertilized, the flower will actually be gone because it will get fruit as a result. So what you will learn in this video is to identify and state the function of sepal, petal, stamen, carpels of insect-pollinated flower, as well as stamen, stigma of wind-pollinated flower. Now you can see there's a difference between the amount of parts of insect-pollinated flower and wind-pollinated flower that you have to know. Why is this the case? Is because you need to walk your way around the traditional thinking that, oh, flower, it must have a petal. No, wind-pollinated flower actually doesn't have petals, which you will see later on. So you need to turn your traditional mindset of flower around when we come to wind-pollinated flower, because there's no petal. Flower is not just about petal. There are other parts. The more important parts are the stamen as well as carpel. So if you have those, it is a flower. And lastly, we will learn how to compare an insect-pollinated flower to a wind-pollinated flower, which is not difficult, as you can see. So before we continue, let us just take a look at different flowers. When we take a look at insect-pollinated flower, I think the distinctive feature is the petals. While for wind-pollinated flower, there is a lack of petals. So you need to warp your head around that, oh, flower is just the petal. No, it's not just the defining feature of a flower. For flower, right, it needs to contain the reproductive organ. You can see that wind-pollinated flower, there is actually no petal at all. The last one is not petal, they are pine cone. Now, let us continue with the naming of different parts of the flower. Now, what we are most concerned with is the insect-pollinated flower. And a typical flower or a diagram of a flower will look like this. First, you can see the petal. They are actually modified leaf, and it will help to attract insect. And because the petal is large, it allows the insect to land on it. We have our sepal, which is modified leaf. The main purpose is to protect the flower when it is still budding. So you can imagine, let's say a rosebud, the sepal will be covering the petal, protecting it. For the actual sex organ of the flower, we have the female part, which is called the carpel. Carpel comes from the Greek word karpos, which means fruit. The female part of the flower consists of stigma, which is at the tip, and ovary, which contains the ovum. For the male part, it is easier to remember because we can see that it is called stamen. You can see the word man down there. It is the male part. Carpel is the female part. Stamen is the male part. It consists of the anther, which is at the tip, and filament, which is the stalk. So let us take a look at the function. First, the male parts of the flower. And at the tip, we have the anther, which produces the pollen grain. The pollen sac can be found on the anther, and they contains pollen grain. Pollen grain is the male gametes or the male sex cell, something like your sperm. the filament will hold the anther in suitable position for dispersal of the pollen grain. For insect-pollinated flower as well as wind-pollinated flower, the function of their anther and filament is the same. As for the female part of the flower, first we have our stigma, which is at the tip. It is important for receiving the pollen grain. So pollen grain will drop onto the stigma, and if the stigma is mature, it will stimulate the germination of the pollen grains. That means it will cause the pollen grains to grow towards the ovary. And the pollen grain will first grow through the style, which connects the ovary, and finally grows towards the ovary. So ovary will contain one or more ovules, and ovules will contain ovum. Now, it's a mouthful, and you might not understand what is the difference. Ovules, right, is the same as the egg in human. So in human, ovules is the egg, while ovum, on the other hand, refers to the nucleus in the egg. So this one is for plant. But just bear in mind, for ovum in human, it is actually just referring to the egg. But in plant, ovum is referring to the nucleus of the egg. So, just some inconsistency here. Ovules refers to the egg in plant, while ovum refers to the nucleus of the egg in plant. So the function of stigma, style, and ovary is also the same for insect-pollinated flower as well as wind-pollinated flower. As for wind-pollinated flower, we have learned from the start that you actually do not need to know so much parts, or they actually do not have so much part that you have to know. But what is similar between wind-pollinated flower and insect-pollinated flower is both of them have a stamen. You can see the pollen sac over there, which contains the pollen grain. While for insect-pollinated flower, the stamen is inside the petal. You can see that the stamen of wind-pollinated flower is hanging out. And what's the purpose? Because it is wind-pollinated after all. It has to be outside of the plant or the flower for wind to carry the pollen grain away. And hopefully, they will reach the stigma. While stamen, the appearance is similar to that of insect-pollinated flower, you can see that the stigma is rather different because they are feathery. Why are they feathery? Because being feathery will help it to increase its surface area. For a flower to be wind-pollinated, it is really down to luck whether the wind will carry the pollen grain to another flower. So having a larger surface area will help increase the chance that a pollen grain will land on the stigma. Wind-pollinated flower contains the ovary that house the ovules as well as the ovum for the pollen grain to fertilize. So we can take a look at an example of a wind-pollinated flower in the wild.
So this is an example of a wind-pollinated flower. You can see that the stigma is the feathery part of the flower, while the stamen and the anther, they are protruding out. So protruding out will allow wind to blow their pollen grain away to hopefully the stigma of other plant, the stigma being feathery, will help to increase its surface area, therefore increasing the chance that the pollen grain will land on the feathery stigma. Like I said at the beginning, the petal is non-existent, so it doesn't waste energy trying to attract insect. So it is also very dull and not attractive, unlike the insect pollinated flower.
So here are all the features of insect pollinated flower. Please copy them down. As mentioned, insect pollinated flower have large petal, and most of the time they are brightly colored, and even if they are white in color, they might have some sweet scents, or it is actually not white in color. It is just reflecting ultraviolet light, which we human cannot see, because the purpose of the flower is not meant for human to look and admire. Their purpose is to attract insect. Insect can see ultraviolet light, so it will be attracted to the petal. The stigma is small and compact and within the flower, same as the stamen. This will allow the pollen grain to be brushed onto the insect, and they can also be deposited onto the stigma. We will take a closer look at this later on. The pollen grain is relatively large and has spiky surface, so those spikes are like hooks that can be hooked onto the hair of the insect, which will allow them to travel with the insect to another flower. Most of the time, nectar is present in the wall of ovary, which is why the insect will go all the way into the flower, and as a result, it can deposit the pollen grain. Nectar guides are like patterns that will attract the insect towards the ovary, because that is where they can find the nectar, and most of the time they have sweet scent to attract insect. So to take a closer look at pollination by insect, when the insect is collecting nectar, the anther will brush against the insect. The pollen grain will be stuck onto the hair of the insect, and when the insect visits another flower, the pollen grains are transferred to the sticky stigma. So let us take a closer look at a few insect pollinated flowers in the wild.
So you can see an insect pollinated flower. The petal is very conspicuous, that means it's large. So let's track the bee. So if you take a closer look at the flower, you can see the purple patch. That is the nectar guide, and the petal allowed the bee to land on the flower and collect the nectar. Now if we take a closer look at the interior of the flower, you can see that the stamen, or the male part of the flower, is on top. So as the bee enters the flower, pollen grain will get brushed onto the top or the back of the leaf or the bee. Then the bee will fly on to pollinate other flower. So if we pluck out the flower and dissect it a bit, you can see the anther, which contains the pollen grains. So the bee will brush against the anther. Then I guess this is a male flower because it doesn't have any stigma. So a bee will get the pollen grain on its back. Then after collecting pollen or collecting nectar from this flower, it will fly off to hopefully a female flower. Then it will deposit the pollen grain into the stigma, which is normally at a lower position as compared to the anther. Why the bee will go in further is because the nectar is normally at the bottom of the flower. So this one is the anther.
As for wind pollinated flower, please copy down the feature. So most of the time you will not see any petal in wind pollinated flower because it is redundant. It doesn't need to attract anyone. So without the petal, wind can blow easily through. The stigma is large, feathery, and protruding out. This is to increase the surface area for pollen grain to land on. The stamen, they are long and hang out so that the wind can easily blow the pollen grain away. The pollen grain produced by wind pollinated flower are relatively small compared to the insect pollinated flower, and they are normally smooth as well because they do not need to hook themselves like a hooker onto the insect. So being small, it will allow them to be easily blown away by the wind because they are light. And because of the chance involved, wind pollinated flower normally produces a lot of pollen grain, a lot more. They can afford to do that because the pollen grain are normally smaller. So wind pollinated flowers such as the grass over here, they normally lack nectar guide, as well as a sense. So this will be all. I hope that you will be able to differentiate a wind pollinated flower as well as an insect pollinated flower.